All right, let's get started. We are presented with the topic that Bill Clinton was a better president than George Bush. Of course, we're talking about George W. Bush here. Just want to make sure that we don't spend the entire debate talking about the wrong guy. So thank you so much for making this debate possible. I'm excited to get started. And with that, let's begin. So when we're talking about what exactly makes a good president, what is going to Clinton as the better president than George, I'd like to steer clear of any political preferences we may have, and not actually value how well Clinton did in terms of whether or not we agree with his political leanings, but rather how effective statistics, looking at how the country developed during his presidency and how he handled that. I believe it's going to become Bill Clinton was the most effective and the best or the better of the two presidents. So let's talk about the economic development that Bill Clinton was able to create under his administration. So just a few statistics for you here. The poverty rate fell by nearly 4% in 1997, 93 and 2000. This is the largest 6-year drop in over, and it hasn't been beat since. This is according to the Washington Post as of September 5th, 2012. In addition to the poverty rate declining, so lower income people doing well, median wages all around also increased. And while a lot of this is credited to general economic development of the time having to do with the internet, a lot of this is directly correlated to how Bill Clinton handled poverty in the United States. When you take a look at Bill Clinton's welfare reform programs, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, this entirely unique approach to welfare. Bill Clinton was able to include job training as well as financial literacy, and according to the White House archives, the time were 5 times more likely to be working than they were in 1992. So with all of welfare reform, with all the poverty declining, Clinton was able to create a government with the smallest welfare rolls in 32 years, and they hadn't been beat since. In addition, the lowest government spending overall. Just to give you a sense of how well Clinton did economically, he was the only president in recent memory to create a balanced budget, to create not just a balance, to actually get rid of the deficit. He paid off $360 billion national debt. So just to give you a point of comparison, Bush added $3.5 trillion to budget deficits over his 8 years as president. Of course, we're going to go more into comparisons of the two presidents as we continue, but with that, case as to why Bill Clinton was a successful president, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, and pleasure to be debating with you. I apologize for some scheduling conflicts. Glad we can make this happen. So we have to start off, like you said, you want to stay into statistics and all that, political, arguments aside. So by starting off by what makes a good president, CNN published an article back in 2012 that defines the greatness of a president, is what they like to call it, and it comes down to a strong character, someone who isn't afraid to do what is right, the ability to handle major crisis, and their policy. Of course, oversimplification. So we started off talking about economics. I'll respond to you at on that level to start. So the poverty rate did decrease during the 1990s. That's absolutely true. But if you look at the people in poverty, they suffered an increasingly amount. They went to what they call the extreme poverty level. That's actually a term that was coined by Bernie Sanders, who actually, credits Bill Clinton for creating the extreme poverty group, and something that he, talked about a lot during his campaign in the past year. Now, you talk about how Bill Clinton, didn't spend as much and, brought the deficit down. He actually wanted to spend a lot more. It's because he was up against a, entirely Republican Congress who had exercised fiscal restraint on the president to stop him from spending more. And he even tried to find loopholes into, increasing the GDP at that time through stuff such as NAFTA, or through stuff which, lowered environmental registrations and cost $15 billion worth of pollution at the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as giving China major favored nation status, most favored nation status, when they were, taking a step back on their human rights and, child labor, and they just had all these issues. And even with that, the debt to GDP ratio, which is the most accurate way to, kind of compare how these presidents do as far as economically, was at the worst it had been in 50 years, and immediately got better after George W. Bush was elected into office and decreased throughout his entire presidency and improved. And so with that, I'll pass that back to you.
All right. So just in terms of the extreme poverty, no, Bill Clinton did a lot to reduce long-term poverty, to help extreme poverty out of poverty through a lot of his through a lot of smart policies, including the fact that, for example, that Bill Clinton was able to integrate the internet into 95% of public schools. That was up from 35% just a few years earlier in 1994. And with integrating things to the internet, expanding opportunity to college, with expanding the GI Bill, lots of these education, the welfare allowed these people in the long term poverty because they actually had the resources behind them to do so. And when you take a, you mentioned foreign policy, it's quite clear that that Bush was a failure on the foreign policy level. If you take a look at what he did abroad in Afghanistan and Iraq, whether or not you agree with I guess I could say whether or not you even, the fact of the matter is that we did not belong there in the first place. Even if you go based on President George W. Bush's information in the first place, that information was false. It's universally agreed upon in the current political climate in history classes that this information about new of mass destruction that Iraq had was false. This information was strictly false. And the amount of civilian casualties, the lives lost in these conflicts was simply, it's unfathomable how much we invested into this problem, how much lives, how much money we invested into this problem, considering that it wasn't even a problem in the first place, that the information that we started this policy. How do you address that?
Okay, so to start, I'll respond to your issue of how you said the extreme poverty was actually him trying to bring people out of poverty. Well, the amount of households per that live on $2 or less per day never decreased significantly from the 1990s all the way to 2011, where, you know, that's when it hit its all-time high. Never saw a major decrease in extreme poverty levels, okay? And that's even with houses that have government subsidies such as food stamps, all right? And then you move on, you said that Bush completely failed in the foreign policy area, and I think that's a major, I have to majorly disagree right there. If you look at something like Rwanda, for example, where a genocide happened, right? Genocide in Rwanda. In June 2014, on the 20th anniversary, the U.S. diplomats under President Clinton did an interview and said they went into explicit detail about the violence and what was happening in Rwanda. But Bill Clinton's foreign policy of how he didn't want to get involved ignored all that information, which they said they literally wrote chapters of reports giving it directly to the president on what was happening. He just completely dismissed it, and then 1 million people lost their lives. Compare that to something like George W. Bush in Sudan, where he was the first, even before the UN, to classify Sudan as genocide, and immediately went and started, meeting with leaders in Africa, such as the leader of South Africa and all these African countries, to get a solution done. So I don't think just because George W. Bush went into the Middle East completely discredits everything else he did during his presidency to foreign policy, especially when Bill Clinton sat aside and let innocent people get murdered in this country when he had all the knowledge that was happening. And so with that, I'll pass it back to you.
In terms of Rwanda, obviously, I'm not going to suggest that wasn't and that there wasn't a genocide happening in Rwanda. Of course, there was. But the question is, what is the smartest policy to take? What is the most effective? And I would say there's an ongoing debate about America's role in political world, in taking care of people that don't actually in America's borders. There's ongoing debate about that. But what I would say is that the implications, the long-reaching disaster of the Middle East, the long-reaching disaster in Afghanistan, all of these long-reaching, these huge impacts that are simply due to the fact that the policies were created on false information. In terms of what the United States could have actually done, could have actually prevented, I say that in Iraq and Afghanistan was actually made much worse by President Bush. That those conflicts have actually weighed even heavier on American politics, weighed even heavier on those regions because of the actions that the Bush administration took.
Okay, so on to that, one of the criteria I spoke of earlier about comparing presidents was the ability to, handling situations under crisis, right? So you have something like 9/11 happen, which was the biggest and basically the only attack from a foreign power on U.S. soil in the mainland United States since the War of 1812 for the Spanish-American War, had some fighting, but basically the major one that everybody can, affiliate to. And so something such as that action has to be taken. I'm not going to say everything was done perfectly because no president's done perfectly, but we're getting into like the what ifs of what would have happened. And as far as our intervention in the Middle East, a lot of people can argue, and I personally do believe that it was a good thing that we did intervene in the Middle East to the extent that we did. Like I said, nobody's perfect, and I'm not gonna, get off on a tangent on that because we promised to stay out of like political beliefs and whatnot. But I do think that action had to be taken, and the American opinion of the people at the time did show that they were also in favor of action being taken in the Middle East, as they did feel like they were attacked from a foreign power. To get on to just some of other of Bill Clinton's things he tried to accomplish when he's getting into office, he failed in a lot of his campaign promises, which most presidents do, not accomplish all their campaign promises. But there were significant points of his campaign that he just wasn't able to accomplish compared to somebody like George Bush, who was credited with actually following through with a significant amount of the claims he made. Bill Clinton wasn't able to get rid of the ban on homosexuals from serving in the military. He had to opt for the don't ask, don't tell policy. He wasn't able to, get the school regulations up the way he wanted to. Education did not improve during the 90s, aside from a small burst because of the internet, but not nearly to the level he promised it would be at. And on top of that, like I stated before, the economy, while, things were good, the average American did have more money in their pocket, overall was hurt during his presidency because of how much debt we incurred during the time. And, another criteria I spoke of earlier is the president's image to the rest of the world. And, I think we can both agree that Bill Clinton did have some issues in that department of how the U.S. was viewed at the time to the rest of the world. And so with that, I'll pass it back to you.
A few things to tackle here. In terms of the fact that Bill Clinton's economic policies actually, you said, were debt. I mean, this is just factually incorrect. Bill Clinton, as you mentioned, that largely because of Congress, regardless, the administration of Bill Clinton was way more fiscally responsible, way more fiscally effective than the Bush administration. I mean, $360 billion paid off of the national debt. That national debt has done nothing but continue. It increased exponentially during the time that Bush was president. $3.5 trillion accumulated in budget deficits during the Bush years. So I would say that in terms of debt being accumulated in the course of the Clinton administration, that's just not true. In terms of image abroad, I'm not going to stand up here and defend Bill Clinton's actions in the bedroom, or in the Oval Office rather. But I would argue that the image of the image of American imperialism, neo-imperialism, and interventionism abroad that was fostered under Bush, the fact that the entire military campaign was founded on false information, I'd say that that's a much larger detriment to to the image of America abroad. And in terms of, I mean, that's just statistically provable to see that the image of America decreased during the Bush years. The fact is that anti-American sentiment increased tremendously abroad. Part of the reason why you have groups like ISIS in the first place, the Taliban in Afghanistan, there's a tremendous in all of this because the Bush administration handled these situations so poorly, because they didn't set up long-lasting structures in Iraq and security structure in Afghanistan to ensure that after the military withdrew, that those insurgents rise up again. So in terms of the long-term impacts of both the economy as well as the foreign policy, I think that Clinton is a league ahead of the rest, ahead of Bush, in terms of the image, as the economics and the foreign policy.
Okay, so to start with your discussion on the economic policy, you said just it's completely false. No, it's not completely false whatsoever. If you just simply Google the debt, to GDP ratio across U.S. history, you'll find that during the Bush era, it went down significantly. Sure, the national debt got paid off during Clinton's administration, but when the GDP is increasing, statically at around 1%, that's, meaningless. During, war, you're going to incur debt, but you have people making planes, tanks, guns, food to send out, metal, productivity. It's a fact that during war, your GDP is going to increase. And not only that, the GDP to debt ratio, like I said, was some of the best it had been in about 40 years compared to Clinton having it be the worst it had been in about 40 years. Now, onto the level of foreign policy, you credit ISIS and all these things to how Bush handled things in the Middle East. I think, honestly, that's a little absurd. The issues with ISIS and, radical Islam in the Middle East cannot be completely credited to George W. Bush. That's credited back to, the foundation of Israel. You can trace it back to the Crusades. So just pinning all the problems on Bush, I think, is a little, reasonable and a little intellectually dishonest. But on top of that, there's nothing to say. We did end up taking out Osama bin Laden eventually during Obama's presidency, but the precedent was set there by Bush, as well as the specific military operations were set up by Bush. And so what happens is we take out the main money supply of Al Qaeda. That's at least some improvement. I can't find any statistical or factual evidence that's going to say that things would have been better if we hadn't have gotten involved. Now, I'm not going to argue that it was perfectly implemented, because that's nobody's perfect. But you can't just credit, Bush handled this thing bad, so now this bad thing happens today and it's his fault. I don't think that's reasonable to argue from that standpoint.
Okay, so I apologize if my argument was misconstrued. I didn't mean to suggest that radical Islam and that ISIS are a direct result of President Bush. But the point that I was, these issues largely wouldn't have been such huge issues. There wouldn't be such a huge anti-American sentiment in the region if the administration hadn't been involved there in the first place. And in addition, these situations, whether you agree that we should have been involved or not, these situations were handled poorly. That's indisputable. The fact of the matter is that there were no long-term plans for how to actually solve the problem. And clearly, I mean, if you look at the long-term effects that these policies have had, has the Middle East, has the situation in Iraq actually improved since Bush entered that region, since Bush took on those responsibilities? I would argue, no, absolutely not. Iraq is no more stable now under when Bush went in there in the first place. And especially when you hear all of the lives lost, the civilian. You mentioned that the economy expanded because it's a war. Of course, that's true. But the war on terror, all of these policies, I really don't see them as justified. Losing American lives abroad, all of these people be in the conflict in the first place because there were no weapons of mass. The costs of this conflict, when you consider the fact that we really didn't accomplish anything, I think far outweigh any potential opponent may claim those policies did have. I'd like to go into the offensive a little bit now, because we've been talking about, defending. I want to talk about the real inherent problems behind Bush's presidency, especially domestically. The Bush tax cuts, which were intended to address the 2001 recession, those tax cuts actually did improve the 2001 recession. But what is that recession came to a close, those cuts didn't. Instead, and that's largely credited for having worsened the housing boom, for having depleted revenues. The 2008 recession that happened as Bush was leaving office. So I think that in terms of Bush's domestic policy, the economics abroad, it's plain that the economy was just not well under Bush as it was under Clinton.
Okay, so to start off with your first statement about how Iraq is not as good today as it actually was back when Bush entered Iraq. So one of my best friends, his name's Matham, he actually was born and raised in Iraq. He's a little bit older than me, probably about 10 years older than me. So he actually remembers and understands, some of this to a much more extent than I would, being a lot younger than he is. And things were just significantly better in the country of Iraq than they were back then. Now, even though the government is not what we'd like it to be, they have significantly better human rights. They have significantly better living conditions. Like he has they have much better technology, medical equipment. Just they had the issue with ISIS, which we dealt with in Mosul and liberated, but they have better dams to give people water. Just overall, the country is a better place to live now. than compared to when we went in originally back in 2001. Things have improved, so I don't understand how you can come from a basis saying that things are not as good now. They talked about Bush, the tax cuts to bring out the recession. That's true, and he did not get rid of them. But the reason that you get rid of a tax cut and you increase taxes is when you're trying to pay off your deficit, right? But the GDP to debt ratio, once again, was at the best it had been in several years. And so there wasn't directly that need. And then, you say how it caused the housing boom. I don't see how that is either, because, when you pump into the economy, right, when that money is going into the economy instead of being collected, it does decrease interest rates, but that wasn't the main cause of the housing boom. I would love to see an article where they directly say, because of President Bush's tax cuts, we went directly into the housing crisis. I don't think makes economic sense to just cite it to that one thing. A lot of people credit that to how the Federal Reserve handled their monetary policy during the time. And so I think that's, once again, a little ridiculous to give the president that much power to have this decisive one act to just change the entire economy domestically like that.
I think there's a little bit of connectivity problems. I the argument there, but in terms of, I'm not trying to suggest that the Bush tax cuts are the leading reason for the 2008 financial crisis. Obviously, that would be absurd. But economists largely agree that this worsened the recession because of the fact that all of these people with houses they had enormous incomes because of these tax cuts. All these people that were continuing to invest in housing, continuing to speculate about these costs, and that once that recession actually hit, because the government had largely contributed to all these tax cuts, because the government didn't have a lot of disposable funds in order to eliminate this recession, it ultimately worsened the recession. I'm not saying that these tax cuts are the cause of the recession, but rather that they worsened the recession. In terms of Iraq being a better country now than it was 20 years ago, that the country has been stagnant for 20 years. What I meant to say is that did the Bush efforts in the country actually improve the standard there? And the answer is no. Aside from the anecdotal evidence that my opponent gave, the vast majority of improvements that have happened to Iraq have largely been a result of globalization in the region, not as a result of military intervention in the region. Anything, military intervention only led to a further and set the stage conflicts like ISIS to come. And considering the fact that the Bush administration, without a fully formed exit plan in Iraq, simply left a lot of those weapons pulled out of without a fully formed exit plan. So I don't think that it's as cut and dry to say that Iraq is a better country now, therefore Bush's policies were well advised at the time, because that's just not true. So in terms of, I think that it's clear in terms of economic development at home, the reduction in poverty, median wages increasing overall, welfare reform, government, the lowest government spending in 3 decades and still has not been matched. In terms of the economic responsibility administration compared to the Bush administration, that's just a question. In terms of the foreign policy, I think that the long-reaching implications of the Bush administration's foreign policy has been detrimental to regions like the Middle East as well as places like Afghanistan. And I think that most Americans would agree that in the wake of both of these presidents, in hindsight, we can see that Clinton's years as president were far more effective than Bush's.
Okay, so to start off, yeah, we were having some connection issues, so I didn't hear all of your argument either. But to start off, you said that Iraq is not directly because of Bush. I'm not going to say it's 100% because of George Bush's intervention and the military practices that we had there, but that does play a part. That gave them most of the time when these countries look to invest in another country, they look for political stability, because that normally ensures that they're going to get the most out of their investment. And so when we enter Iraq, that shows some sort of political stability, since we're the United States and we're the leader of the free world. And so in the long run, that does have a longer lasting impact than just, military personnel on the ground. Now, to go on to your point about how you said it's just indisputable that Clinton's economic policies are better, you've still yet to respond to how the debt to GDP GDP ratio during Clinton's years in office were the worst they had been in 40 years, compared to Bush, where they immediately had improved during his time in office and basically stayed that way until he left office and was succeeded by Obama. And so I don't think it's cut and dry as that. Now, to continue on to your point and how you say all of foreign policy is completely Clinton's favored, you basically attack Bush on one example, but you've yet to give an example of how Clinton's foreign policies were superior to that of Bush, as Clinton just sat in the Oral Office, as many foreigners like to call it during the time, and just simply did nothing while genocides happened across the world, compared to Bush, who was proactive in most of these issues, like in Sudan and even in the Middle East to some extent, where he believed he was going in there to stop a crisis, but was unfortunately misinformed. I don't see how you can push how good Clinton's foreign policy was when he just sat in his chair in the Oral Office, while you can just demonize Bush for the things that he did, when there's not any evidence to support that what Bill Clinton did was more beneficial for the world, especially when 1 million people were killed in a country that were innocents.
Because this is the last bit of time here, I'm going to just spend most of my time tying up any loose ends. So in terms of the ratio, the GDP was extraordinary. It was a solid 3% growth. The GDP was not only how shall I say, not only stable, but it was beneficial toward the country. Consistent rate, and a lot of this had to do with Bill Clinton's economic policies, with the people that he appointed for example, Robert Rush, Labor Secretary. A lot of these had to do with the policies that were being implemented, but also down below that he had supervised. Okay, looks like I only have 10 seconds. I'd just like to urge a vote in the affirmation that Bill Clinton is a better president than Bush, because in hindsight, the legacy of Bush is far more detrimental worldwide than Clinton's.
So to start with that, one of the points you just made about how the GDP increased steadily 3 or 4%, I believe was the number you gave during Clinton's presidency, that means nothing. Nominal GDP actually means very minimally when you look at things. Okay, real GDP is a little better, but still the GDP to debt ratio is by far the best way to look at how a country is developing economically. I can go out if I'm the president and spend $1 million on a solid gold road, and that will improve GDP, but I'm going to incur debt, and I'm not going to gain anything off a solid gold road, and therefore it actually makes no impact if you look at the debt to GDP ratio. Now you talk about how devastating it was for the world when with all of Bush's policies. I think the way that Bill Clinton represented America and his handling of crisis like the Rwanda genocide were much more detrimental to the image of the United States at the time, and did set a precedent. And that's why many people were hesitant to call Sudan an active genocide until, George Bush took a step to the plate on that. If you look at economic policies, there's no argument, and my opponent has not been able to, stand against the argument that George Bush had a vastly superior economic system as the debt to GDP ratio increased. GDP increased more at the time, and Bill Clinton, he keeps citing that Bill Clinton did pay off some of the deficit, and that was only because Congress limited him from restraining more money. Bill Clinton took every single act he could to try and, increase GDP more, and he couldn't do it. He, gave up environmental restrictions with NAFTA, where $15 billion worth of environmental hazards were pumped into the air at the U.S.-Mexico border. He didn't care about human rights when he gave China most favored nation status, just let go of all moral and ethical high ground just for the sake of the economy, which did not improve that much and did not outweigh Bush's. And to summarize my argument here, he said, about how the way that the lasting impact of the presidencies, I feel like Bush set a much larger precedent for the future when it comes to how America handles foreign policy and how we defend ourselves, since that was basically the first major terrorist attack in note. And now that you have terrorist attacks popping up all around the world, I think that in the recent future, we will see how Bush's policies are going to impact the country and the world in a much heavier way than Bill Clinton sitting back in his chair. It was an honor to debate with you. I hope we can debate again soon.